To understand biblical archaeology, we first have to let go of the movies. The public expectation usually involves rapid excavations, hidden chambers, and pulling a shining, definitive artifact from the sand. But the reality of the discipline looks much more like this: staring at dirt, scraping a trench floor, and bucket chaining debris day after day. This romanticized view fuels a common yet flawed assumption that an archaeologist's primary goal is to dig up specific items, a physical receipt, a carved nameplate, or an ancient weapon that will prove or disprove the historical text of the Bible. The science of archaeology is far more methodical. It is the slow, decades-long compilation of data. Excavators log pottery shards, map ash layers, plot coordinates into databases, and wait years before drawing significant insights from the aggregate. Occasionally, this slow process yields a narrow convergence. This happens when a physical find directly intersects with a specific person or event mentioned in the biblical text. These moments capture headlines, but they are exceptionally rare. You cannot build a rigorous academic framework relying solely on the hope of finding a direct physical point of contact. Instead, archaeologists like William Dever advocate for relying on broad convergence. Rather than looking for a specific name carved into a rock, broad convergence looks at the overlapping background. It uses archaeological data to illuminate the baseline worldview, the social structures, and the daily cultural environment of the ancient Near East. Two of the most important archaeological discoveries for biblical study, the administrative archives of the ancient city of Mari and the Epic of Gilgamesh, provide this context. They do not mention the Israelites directly, but they clarify the historical and theological environment in which the biblical authors lived. By prioritizing broad convergence, we move beyond the fragile logic of the treasure hunt and engage with archaeology as a structural, historical discipline. Take a look at this topographical map of the ancient Near East. Located just inside the modern-day Syrian border, near the Euphrates River, sits the ancient site of Mari. It controlled a valley connecting major ancient trade routes between Mesopotamia and the Levant. Decades of excavation here revealed three distinct phases of ancient occupation. The ruins in these mud brick corridors belong primarily to the later stages of development, specifically a sophisticated central palace system known to archaeologists as City 3. City 3 was ruled by an Amorite king named Zimri-Lim around 1750 BCE. Before his city was sacked by the Babylonians, his administration produced a massive hoard of cuneiform tablets documenting the daily operations of the region. Within these administrative texts, researchers identified a recurring socio-political structure known as a dimorphic society. Dimorphism refers to a single society composed of two separate identifiable elements. In Mari, this meant a settled urban population living inside the city walls, existing alongside mobile, seasonal agro-pastoralists who moved their herds through the surrounding regions. The texts document the continuous interaction between these two groups. They detail the necessary economic collaboration, as well as the frequent friction between the centralized urbanites and the nomadic herders. This dimorphic structure mirrors the social environment described in the patriarchal narratives. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob functioned in the same manner as the Amorite mobile pastoralists described in the Mari texts, following seasonal migration patterns up and down the Central Ridge Road. When the book of Genesis describes Abraham engaging with the king of Salem, or Lot negotiating with the established urban centers of Sodom and Gomorrah, it is describing a documented ancient Near Eastern social interaction. We must observe strict academic limits here. The administrative archives of Mari do not mention Abraham, and they cannot be used to prove his specific historical existence. What Mari does prove is that the background conditions described in Genesis match documented history. The rhythms of life, the economic realities, and tension between cities and nomads reflect an authentic Middle Bronze Age reality rather than a later invention. Before discovering external texts, scholars struggled to define the specific institutional role of the Old Testament prophets. They relied almost entirely on the biblical text itself to reconstruct how these figures functioned in society, playing historical shadow games with limited data. The Mari archives resolved much of this ambiguity. The cuneiform tablets explicitly detail a highly structured prophetic institution operating in the ancient Near East, hundreds of years before Israel even had a monarchy. As this matrix illustrates, the Mari texts show us that prophecy was not defined by a single title, but by a functional profile. First, there was the method of delivery, split between intuitive and deductive prophecy. Intuitive prophecy occurred when an individual spontaneously received a word from a divine spirit. Deductive prophecy required observing physical phenomena, like the flight path of a bird, and interpreting it through an established canon of omens. The second axis defining a prophet's profile was proximity to power, on a spectrum from central to peripheral. Plotting biblical prophets here, Isaiah and Nathan operated centrally, with close access to the king. Elisha and Elisha functioned peripherally, critiquing from the wilderness fringes. The Mari texts confirm that Israel's prophets were not a sociological anomaly. They were operating within a normalized, pre-existing ancient Near Eastern institutional framework that was widely understood across the region. While Mari clarifies the social mechanics of the ancient world, we look to literature to understand its mindset. For this, the Epic of Gilgamesh serves as a primary comparative textual tool. The discovery of the epic dates back to the 19th century excavations of ancient Mesopotamian capitals. Archaeologists like Austin Henry Layard and Hormost Rassam shipped thousands of broken clay tablets to the British Museum during initial sweeps of the region. In the basement of the museum, a researcher named George Smith began teaching himself Akkadian cuneiform to repair and read those shattered fragments. In 1872, Smith deciphered Tablet 11. As he translated, he realized he was reading the story of Utnapishtim, an ancient figure who survived a divinely ordained global flood by building a massive boat. The parallels to Genesis were striking. As more fragments were uncovered, scholars realized the Epic of Gilgamesh was not originally written as one continuous story. Scribes had taken older, individual tales about the king of Uruk and eventually fused them together to form a unified narrative. The epic went through centuries of literary development. Later scribes compiled, edited, and clarified the text, smoothing out the distinct source materials to create the complex philosophical narrative we have today. This documented scribal convention provides a parallel historical model. It demonstrates how ancient editors worked, helping us understand the complex canonical compilation process of the Old Testament itself. But the most significant value of Gilgamesh lies in its theology. While the structural frameworks of the two flood narratives are nearly identical, analyzing them side by side exposes the differences in how each culture viewed the divine. In the Mesopotamian account, the deities act on petty impulses. They send the flood for trivial reasons, and as the waters rise, they become terrified of their own creation, cowering in fear. Later, they bicker over who leaked the plan to humanity. The biblical account presents a stark contrast. Yahweh acts quietly, remains entirely sovereign over the rising waters, and initiates the flood based on explicit, deliberate moral grounds regarding human corruption. By sharing a common narrative blueprint, the text of Gilgamesh acts as a foil. It throws the specific theological worldview of the Israelite authors into sharp relief against the surrounding culture. Demanding that an archaeologist pull a specific artifact out of the ground to validate a biblical name misses the potential of the discipline. Relying entirely on narrow convergences limits our understanding to a few disconnected data points. True historical validation requires building a comprehensive framework. It combines social architecture, literary architecture, and theological contrast to support our reading of the biblical text. The records at Mari secure that first pillar. They demonstrate that the socio-political dynamics, dimorphic societies, and institutional profiles found in the biblical narratives were accurate reflections of the ancient world. The Gilgamesh epic secures the rest of the foundation. It provides the mechanical blueprint for how ancient texts were compiled over time, while simultaneously highlighting the distinct moral and theological stance of the biblical authors. Biblical archaeology does not exist to hunt for physical receipts. By reverse engineering how the rest of the ancient Near East lived, wrote, and believed, archaeology provides the historical grounding and reveals the specific